Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Friday the 20th of January. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 331 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will discuss today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. The US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has called for allies to dig deeper in their support for Ukraine as history is watching us. Speaking at a meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group in Germany, Austin said, "This is a crucial moment. Russia is regrouping, recruiting, and trying to re-equip. Ukrainian people are watching us. The Kremlin is watching us, and history is watching us. So we won't let up. And we won't waver in our determination to help Ukraine defend itself from Russia's imperial aggression." The meeting at the US Ramstein base was attended in person by Ukraine's Defense Minister, Alexei Reznikov, and was addressed via video link by Ukraine's President, Volodymyr Zelensky. President Zelensky has said that his government was expecting strong decisions from defense leaders of NATO and other countries meeting today to discuss boosting Ukraine's ability to confront Russian forces with modern battle tanks. Ukraine says it has arrested 7 Russian agents in Dnipro who are accused of assisting missile attacks on the city. The UK Ministry of Defence has stated that the Wagner mercenary group almost certainly now commands up to 50,000 fighters in Ukraine and has become a key component of the Ukraine campaign. The group of 11 NATO countries pledged a raft of new military aid for Ukraine ahead of today's meeting at Ramstein in Germany. The aid from countries including Britain, Estonia, Latvia and Poland will include tens of Stinger air defence systems, S-60 anti-aircraft guns, machine guns and training, according to a statement. The US has announced $2.5 billion in new weaponry and munitions from Ukraine, including 90 Stryker armoured personnel carriers, an additional 59 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, Avenger air defence systems, and large and small munitions. That's according to a statement from the Pentagon. The UK has announced plans to send 600 Brimstone missiles to Ukraine, and Poland said it was sending S-60 anti-aircraft guns with 70,000 rounds of ammunition and was ready to donate a company of German-made Leopard 2 tanks. Lithuania's defence minister has said several countries will announce sending Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine at the meeting today. But Germany's Chancellor Olaf Scholz has yet to agree to the supply of Leopard 2 tanks to Ukraine. The tanks are manufactured in Germany. Estonia's defence minister, Hanno Pevkur, announced his country will send military equipment to Ukraine worth €113 million in its latest package of support. And Denmark announced it will donate 19 French-made Caesar howitzer artillery systems to Kyiv. The Kremlin has said Russia will achieve its goals in Ukraine one way or another, and the sooner that Kyiv accepts its demands, the sooner the conflict will end. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined this evening by Maureen Watt, who's a retired politician and former Minister for Mental Health in the Scottish Government. Maureen was a regional MSP for the North East of Scotland from 2006 until 2011, and was then the member of our Scottish Parliament, representing the constituency of Aberdeen South and North Kincardine from 2011 to 2021 when she retired. Maureen has also been a teacher and a councillor, amongst many other roles. Maureen, good evening. How are you keeping?
Yes, good evening, Andrew. Nice to see you again. Yeah, I'm keeping well, but just freezing. I'm looking forward to the temperature rising outside in the next couple of days.
Well, I'm glad to hear that you're keeping well despite the temperature. Maureen, you and I are meeting most Friday evenings at the moment. Do you think that anyone will notice?
Well, I hadn't noticed, Andrew, so maybe not.
Oh, well, that's okay then. We'll press on regardless. Uh, because it's Friday and because there was a great deal of news from Ukraine this afternoon, I was going to talk to you briefly about that. There's been a great deal of military news in particular over the past 48 hours. I was talking there about the allies who are supporting Ukraine meeting at the huge US military airbase at Ramstein. And in the run up to that meeting, the UK has offered to send a number of Challenger 2 main battle tanks, and Germany is coming under pressure from Poland to allow the Poles to send their Leopard 2 main battle tanks. For the Poles to do that, technically, it requires permission from Germany. So the point is, however, that no ally has to this point sent such heavy armour to the war zone in Ukraine. And so do you think, does this feel like an important and or a dangerous point in the war for Europe and for NATO, let alone for Ukraine?
Well, certainly when there's ramping up, that's a possibility. I think the meeting of the defence ministers has obviously been a bit of well, if you're sending that, we must send something. So it looks like a long list of armory that's going to be sent to the Ukraine. But I keep thinking it's not all that long ago that countries were winding down on their traditional types of weaponry because they thought that any wars were going to be fought in a different way. And here we are, back a century ago, where armies are building and digging themselves into trenches. So it looks as if the war isn't going to stop or come to a halt anytime soon. And, Ukraine has agreed that it's going to keep fighting. And I think the West is duty bound to keep supplying arms and weapons to them in order to halt Russia's aggression, which, from all that's coming out of Moscow, we know is not going to stop at Ukraine. So, yeah, it's a very dangerous situation.
And that thank you, Maureen. That's absolutely right. And I was, maybe again because it's Friday, I was thinking a little bit more slightly philosophically, thinking about as you say, the response from Russia to the arming of Ukraine by NATO and Europe has been belligerent, to put it nicely. With from time to time more excessive threats, including significant escalation in the use of nuclear weapons. And so I was thinking about how do we go about balancing the risks to the wider Europe and NATO, the risks presented by an expanding and belligerent Russia, the risks presented by Russia reacting to the Europe and NATO arming and supporting Ukraine, and then balancing that with the risk to Ukrainian civilians who are being targeted by Russia, apparently now with missiles, which in other circumstances are so huge they would be used to blow up things the size of aircraft carriers. How do we go about balancing all of those risks?
I don't know if you can. I honestly don't know if you can balance these risks. I mean, anything that you see in television in relation to the war, it just looks as if Russia wants to just completely destroy Ukraine. I mean, the number of cities that you see are just in total ruins is absolutely devastating. I mean, talk about a Marshall Plan when this is over in terms of having to rebuild Ukraine. It's going to be absolutely massive. But I was also thinking, and I don't want this to sound in any way flippant, but, we seem to be seeing Russia privatizing its military by use of the Wagner Group. I mean, the way that they can take prisoners out of jails and try and train them up to be soldiers. I mean, what a negation of human rights in any way, shape, or form is that? It's just very frightening, I find.
I completely agree, Maureen, and it's interesting thinking of the extent to which the U.S. military used private contractors in conflicts in the Middle East and in Iraq, and we're seeing similar, but even more extensive and alarming, similar practices in Ukraine now, and in Syria, and in other parts where Wagner are operating on behalf of Russia. And I think your point about the Marshall Plan, a Marshall Plan, is right. I think Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the EU, was talking today about the expectations for the involvement of the private sector and private capital in the huge task which you've identified in terms of rebuilding Ukraine once the conflict has ended. And so both rebuilding Ukraine and the Ukrainian economy once the war has come to an end. So I think we are likely to see moves in that direction, perhaps led by the EU, in terms of investment and collaboration in terms of rebuilding. But thank you for your thoughts about the war in Ukraine as we get closer to the depressing factor of it being the first anniversary of the conflict. I'm sure that we'll be talking about it a great deal more and we'll be reflecting more too. But thank you for that, Maureen. Let's move on to our first other story, our first headline to this evening, because it is being reported that the Conservative Party chair, Nadim Zahawi MP, has agreed to pay a penalty to HMRC as part of a seven-figure settlement over his tax affairs. The former Chancellor of the Exchequer, who still attends the Cabinet, has been subject to extensive questions in Parliament and the media in recent days after it emerged that he agreed to pay millions of pounds to HMRC in December after a settlement with the tax agency. The Guardian is reporting that the former Chancellor paid a penalty imposed by HMRC, part of an estimated £5 million tax bill. Penalties are applied if someone does not pay the correct tax at the correct time. Asked repeatedly about the penalty, Zahawi's spokesperson did not deny one had been paid, nor did they offer any explanation or clarification about the sums involved. Paying a penalty would be hugely embarrassing for Mr. Zahawi and could lead to calls for him to consider his position, given his previous role as Chancellor of the Exchequer in charge of the UK's tax system. He has also been a member of a government that says it has made great efforts to ensure that tax is paid by wealthy citizens in full and on time. So, Maureen, firstly, looking at this more broadly for a moment, if this story is correct, and it's now been widely reported, and as also reported, the Cabinet Office raised a red flag about Nadim Zahawi's tax affairs before he was made Chancellor of the Exchequer, why did Number 10 go ahead with his appointment? Is it hubris? Is it the rules don't apply to these people, they only apply to little folks? What do you think is going on here?
I really do think it's, rules don't apply to them. I mean, increasingly, you wonder if any of them has a moral compass whatsoever. They just do not seem to realize that, I suppose because they live in a different world, that this is really deeply disturbing to people, and especially at this time of year when, small businesses and individuals are rushing to get their tax returns done by the end of January. So, and it talks about a settlement. Well, if you get into difficulty with HMRC, you try and negotiate a payment plan, don't you? You just wonder how much he's being let off paying if a settlement has been agreed. So I think I don't see how someone like that can remain as a member of the Cabinet and as chair of the Tory party if they want to get themselves out of the mire of sleaze that they are in.
Thanks, Maureen. And in terms of hubris, a little bit, or a different approach, whilst we've been on air, in fact, in the last 13 minutes, it's being reported that as a result of the Instagram video that Rishi Sunak appeared in yesterday, he appeared to be travelling in the back of an official car, talking to camera, whilst not wearing a seatbelt. The Prime Minister has now been fined for not wearing a seatbelt in a moving car. Lancashire Police said it has issued the Prime Minister with a conditional offer of a fixed penalty. Number 10 has said that Mr. Sunak fully accepts this was a mistake and has apologised, adding that he will pay the fine. Now, Mr. Sunak's been fined by the police for breaking the law already in the last few months in connection with what was perhaps pleasantly described as the crossfire from the permanent party that Johnson was running in Downing Street during lockdown. So, do you think that the one end of the scale, Rishi Sunak not bothering to wear a seatbelt and being happy to record himself on a video doing so, and at the other end of the extreme, Nadim Zahawi apparently declining to pay several £1 million in tax with regard to the setting up of one of his businesses, YouGov. Do you think this is yet more evidence that it's a widespread problem of hubris and the law not applying to cabinet ministers and their chums, and perhaps expanding that a wee bit? I mentioned that there was a cabinet office red flag with regard to Nadim Zahawi's tax affairs, and of course we had a long period of time when Downing Street had no ethics advisor after they repeatedly resigned. So, in a sense, why? With politicians who are so apparently determined to ignore the law and ignore their obligations that the rest of us seem to be able to comply with, why bother having red flags and checks and ethics advisors if they're just going to be ignored?
Well, yeah, who would want to be an ethics advisor to this Tory government when they, as we've said before, seem to just go ahead and do what they want, whatever. But you know what bothers me, having been a minister, is that all these people have special advisors and civil servants. Now, are they just being ignored by the government ministers of the day, or are they so rubbish at their jobs that they haven't told these ministers what's expected of them in government? I mean, we know that the Home Secretary didn't seem to have read the ministerial code and know what was expected of her. And this just seems to be rife throughout government. I mean, I can't imagine having been in the back of a ministerial car and taken off my seatbelt to do a video. I mean, it just wouldn't happen because the driver, for one, and your permanent secretary or private secretary or whoever's in the car with you would have said, no, that's not going to happen. So do they just poo-poo any advice that they're given and say they'll do it my way, or what? I just can't get my head around that. And if red flags have been flagged about Nadine Zahawi earlier on, why wouldn't you rush immediately to sort out your affairs and make sure that it isn't a story that runs and runs and runs, which seems to be what's happened and has run for months, if you're not trying to avoid paying the tax that you're due. So, I mean, we've talked before about, the rest of the world laughing at us. And this just goes on and on and on. It's just so embarrassing. And please, can we have an election sooner rather than later?
Absolutely, Maureen. Thank you. And I should say briefly, respect to and applaud to Dan Neidl, who's a former senior lawyer, and his organisation Tax Policy Associates, who have been investigating forensically Nadim Zahawi's business and tax affairs since August this year, and are now the work that they've done is coming to light. But let's move on now, because speaking at the Business for Scotland annual dinner last night, the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, warned that this week Scotland has entered a new and more dangerous phase for devolution. She said that the Tories have broken cover, moving from stealth attacks to a full frontal assault by striking down a law which the First Minister said was clearly within the devolved competence and which was passed overwhelmingly in the Scottish Parliament and which, of course, was supported by MSPs from all parties. Ms Sturgeon said, through his actions, the UK Government Secretary of State for Scotland is demonstrating he is sadly not interested in working in partnership. He's decided to act like a Governor-General, treating the Scottish Parliament as a subordinate body, and deciding which democratic decisions and laws he will veto. The First Minister went on to say that Westminster is undermining the Scottish Parliament and Westminster is undermining the Scottish economy. And just as the attack on the Parliament is accelerating, so is the Westminster hit to the economy. Westminster control means the worst of both worlds, a weaker Scottish Parliament and a weaker economy, she said. In fact, she continued, the result of decades of Westminster economic mismanagement is now becoming clear, not just for Scotland, but for the UK as a whole. Those failures were taking hold before Brexit, but Brexit will make them much worse. Turning to the Labour Party, the First Minister added, despite the evidence of the economic damage piling up, Labour now supports wholeheartedly the Tory decision to leave both the EU and the single market. The First Minister accused Labour and the Tories of a conspiracy of silence to shut down any talk of Brexit damage, saying that the victims of the Labour-Tory conspiracy are millions of ordinary people paying the price of unnecessary spending cuts. Ms Sturgeon finished by saying that damaging, tightened Westminster control is one future for Scotland, and the other is to become independent. In an independent Scotland, like all other countries, there are no guarantees. Our success will depend on the decisions we make. But if we look around Europe, we can take heart and inspiration. Comparable independent countries to Scotland, such as Finland, Denmark, and Ireland, have higher national incomes per head than the UK. And they aren't just wealthier, they are fairer too, she said. They have higher productivity and lower poverty. So the question is, with all our resources and talent, why not Scotland? So Maureen, firstly, last night the First Minister described Alistair Jack of acting like a Governor-General in deciding which Scottish law he wanted to veto. And of course, earlier in the week, we saw the Labour MSP Paul Sweeney saying it feels like a politically malicious act, and I think it's about time that Viceroy Jack got back in his box. So are the First Minister and Paul Sweeney right? Alistair Jack is behaving like a British Empire Governor-General or perhaps a Viceroy. Maybe a Viceroy's hat is probably more to Mr Jack's taste, perhaps.
Well, I think we know that he's looking forward to getting his ermine as well, isn't he? Because
Yes.
I think he's been nominated to go to the Lords at some point. So, yes, he is. You get the feeling that they were just waiting for something to happen in Scotland that they could try and get at the Scottish Parliament, and the GRR is that piece of legislation, which, to suggest that the Scottish Parliament didn't look into all aspects, and the Scottish Government before it presented the bill to Parliament, all aspects of its competence is just a nonsense. It's the presiding officer in the end of the day who decides whether the piece of legislation presented by the government is competent. And, lots of work will have been done by loads of people, including constitutional lawyers, to make sure that it was within our competence within the competence of the Scottish Parliament. So this is, in my view, the Westminster Tory government ramping up the you're either for devolution or you're against it. And we know that the Tories, in their heart of hearts, really don't want to have any truck with devolution. They would much rather everything was still controlled by London. And they've actually been shown up over the years of the Scottish Parliament at how little they have done for Scotland over centuries, but particularly decades and decades. And over the lifetime of the Scottish Parliament, 20 odd years now, we've seen how the Scottish Parliament can make a difference to people's lives, can use Scottish taxpayers' money more wisely and more fairer in Scotland, and that is not to their liking at all. So this is a hook on which they can try and diminish the place of the Scottish Parliament and devolution and try and diminish the place of the Scottish Parliament in the minds of Scots. But I don't think it's going to work.
Thanks, Maureen. Now we'll move on because a Northern Irish man has been telling of being tortured by the British Army during the Civil War in the north of Ireland. Jim Auld was one of 14 hooded men subjected to interrogation methods since ruled as torture. In August 1971, British troops interned hundreds of suspects, mostly nationalists and Catholics, at the Long Kesh camp outside Belfast. 14 men, Jim Auld, Pat Shivers, Joe Clark, Michael Donnelly, Kevin Hannaway, Paddy Joe McLean, Francis McGuigan, Patrick McNally, Sean McKenna, Gary McCare, Michael Montgomery, Davy Rogers, Liam Shannon, and Brian Turley were brought to the secret compound inside the barracks at Ballykelly. They were hooded at the time, so they did not see it and were unaware of each other. A doctor examined Jim Auld and declared him fit for interrogation. For at least 7 days and 7 nights, he was subjected to what became known in reports by Amnesty International and other organisations as the 5 techniques: the stress position, hooding, white noise, deprivation of sleep, and little food or drink. When Auld moved from the stress position, he was beaten. Occasionally, the hood was removed and lights were shone into his eyes. Several of the men, including Auld, were bundled onto a helicopter and thrown out, thinking that they were high up. They were in fact only a few feet from the ground. Jim Auld was so tortured by British Army interrogators at the time that he eventually tried to kill himself. Mr. Auld, now a 72-year-old grandfather, is not interested in an official apology or compensation. They can stick any compensation up their arse, he said, and I couldn't care less if they're forced into making an apology, because that's no reflection on what they will do next week. What Auld wants is a howl of public outrage, however belated, over what happened to him and the other men. A howl that shames their tormentors and shames the government into never repeating such abuse. I'm sure the people who were involved in it told their families they were doing great things for the British state, but they were just dirty wee torturers. I want their families to know what they did, so they suffer shame and humiliation. So, Maureen, these events took place during your lifetime and my lifetime and were carried out by the British Army under orders. Do you think that if the circumstances were in any way this replicated again, do you think we would see the same things happening again?
Oh my God, I hope not. Surely not. I mean, we have all these international protocols about how war is conducted and how prisoners are taken, and I don't know about this, but I'm presuming they apply to a country that is well, not at war, but troubles within its own borders, surely. But I mean, this poor man and the 13 others, I mean, it's just so deeply disturbing. I mean, it is torture. And how does that man really survive mentally? I mean, think of the flashbacks and the PTSD and the sleepless nights that they all have. And I quite understand why he wants as many people as possible to know that this is how the British Army behaved. And hopefully, the British Army is taking notes and making sure that this never, ever happens again. But honestly, it's just such an awful story.
Thanks, Maureen. I'll dig into it a little bit further with you if I may. These events at Ballykelly were part of the wider Operation Demetrius, which saw the arrest and incarceration of about 2,000 citizens by the army. And I was reflecting that the current government, such as we have just now, seem always ready to call on the armed forces to do civilian work. The Navy have been manning the border force posts at the airports during industrial action, for example. And we often see the Army and the Air Force being deployed to drive petrol tankers or to drive ambulances or in the distant past fire engines. So the government seems very open to using the armed forces to do civilian work. And before I'm accused of getting too carried away, Colonel Bob Stewart, who's now the Tory MP for Beckenham, has admitted being present during the torture of these men at Ballykelly. So Tory MPs who were involved in this torture now sit in the House of Commons. So I'm wondering, do you think that we might see? And I was thinking about the attempts by the border force agencies in Glasgow to arrest people and take them off the streets, and those efforts being defeated by mass action by citizens in Glasgow. So do you think with a government such as we have at the moment, we might see border force being assisted by the armed forces, not just in airports, but on the streets as well?
Golly, that's getting into really dangerous territory. No, I can't see it. But even if some people are thinking about it, does it mean that there are some preparations going on about that. I mean, I suppose, well, when you come to think of it, there are, mass strikes around, and it could lead to a national strike and civil unrest. I think we're teetering on the brink of civil unrest. So presumably, you're right, Andrew. Your thinking is further on than mine, that there must be contingency plans for this, but that's a very dangerous path for any country to go down. Surely,
Abs-
a minister, or I know Ben Wallace quite well. We fought an election together up here in Aberdeenshire West at one point.
mhm.
No, I can't. Surely, I can't imagine him sanctioning anything like that. But I may be wrong.
That's a good insight, Maureen. Thank you. And without, we won't go into it, but certainly to the point you were making about the impact that this must have had on Mr. Auld, at the time of his torture, he was a 22-year-old trainee dental assistant. And so I'm just reflecting that it possibly tells us something about the difficulty which an occupying force has in dealing with citizens who are engaged in an uprising, because the army inevitably ends up torturing young trainee dental assistants. But we're behind the clock this evening, I'm afraid. We're short for time. So we'd better move on, because we've got more news actually from Ireland, as it happens, because the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, has said he regrets that the Northern Ireland Protocol he agreed with Boris Johnson to end a Brexit impasse was signed without the agreement of unionists and nationalists. The admission came as the latest deadline to restore power sharing in Northern Ireland passed, with the Democratic Unionist Party continuing to refuse to take part in due to protesting against the protocol. Mr. Varadkar said, "The regret that I have is that in the same way Brexit was imposed on Northern Ireland without the support of both communities, the protocol was imposed on Northern Ireland without the support of two communities." Speaking at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Mr. Varadkar added, "Economically, broadly speaking, the protocol is working. There's no hard border between North and South. The single market's integrity has been protected. The Northern Ireland economy is outperforming the UK economy. But I can understand how unionist politicians feel that the protocol has lessened the links, weakened the union between Northern Ireland and Britain. The Northern Ireland Protocol keeps Northern Ireland aligned with some EU trade rules by effectively placing a border in the Irish Sea, and that angers some unionists. As the DUP continues to block power sharing, the UK government has again assumed a legal duty to call a snap assembly election in the region within the next 12 weeks. So, Maureen, I was quoting the Taoiseach there, saying that the protocol is working. There's no hard border. The single market's been protected, and that he can understand how unionist politicians feel that the protocol has lessened the links, weakened the union between Northern Ireland and Britain, and that he regrets that both communities were not engaged to support both the protocol and Brexit. Now, given the kind of language and the posturing we've been seeing, in particular from Westminster over the last few months, this language from the newly reappointed Taoiseach, it sounded to me like extremely diplomatic language, some of the most diplomatic language I think we've heard for a while. So do you think that the ground perhaps is beginning to shift in discussions between Brussels and Westminster and Dublin?
I think there's a move to do that, and obviously Ireland are at the heart of that. But I think it will take a lot to shift the Westminster government, because they have such a big wing of the hard right Brexiteers breathing down their necks all the time, that they're kind of scared to move on this. But isn't it interesting that yet again we have an example of a devolved legislature, the Northern Ireland Assembly, the Unionists and the Nationalists there, not being consulted on the Brexit protocol, but yet they're the ones that have to live with the fallout of that lack of consultation. So I think, Brexit is a word that just cannot be uttered by anybody in Westminster or on the mainstream media. But obviously, they are seeing the huge economic consequences of Brexit. And it's very difficult for them to say that much of our woes at the moment is not due to Brexit. But of course, they're not going to admit that. So, on the QT, if you like, they're trying to see how things can be made different and can be made to work differently. And obviously, Leo Varadkar, who's sharing the job of Taoiseach at the moment, and his turn to take over the reins, has been involved perhaps more than I think it's Mika Martin, the other one. And so any moves about changing it are welcome, but the intransigence and the living in the dark ages of so many of the unionists in Northern Ireland doesn't give me any hope for any meaningful movement on this anytime soon. We've seen how, they should have been calling the Northern Ireland minister should have been calling an election to the assembly by now, and that hasn't happened either. Is it because the private polling that they're doing shows that the unionists will lose even more seats? I don't know, but it's a very difficult situation.
Thanks, Maureen, and that's a great metaphor for using of the Dark Ages. I completely understand that. Thank you. Let's move on now, though, because a federal judge has ordered Donald Trump and one of his attorneys to jointly pay very nearly $1 million in penalties for pursuing a frivolous lawsuit that accused Hillary Clinton, the Democratic National Committee, and other perceived enemies of the former president of engaging in racketeering and concocting a vast conspiracy against him. The suit was dismissed in September, and Trump was ordered to pay tens of thousands in November after one defendant sought sanctions. The latest order came after a group of the remaining defendants, including Hillary Clinton, filed a separate request for sanctions. In a scathing ruling, the US District Court Judge Donald Middlebrooks castigated Trump and his lead attorney, Alina Habba, for abusing the legal system by advancing a lawsuit that furthered his political grievances over the 2017 Russia investigation using arguments characterized by misinformation and errors. The lawsuit, originally filed by Trump in March 2022, alleged that Clinton and the DNC conspired with senior FBI officials and others before the 2016 election to fabricate ties between the Trump campaign and Russia in order to damage him politically. But Middlebrooks dismissed the case after he found that Trump engaged in a scattershot pleading that amounted to an obstruction of justice, and which included allegations that were known to be false. So, Maureen, firstly, the judge wrote, "We are confronted with a lawsuit that should never have been filed, which was completely frivolous, both factually and legally, and which was brought in bad faith for an improper purpose." He wrote that in his 46-page order, which imposed sanctions of $937,989.39 against Trump and Habba. Now, it's not a surprise that revenge litigation, which this was, doesn't work. But firstly, do you think that Trump and his attorney will pay up? Trump's not famous for paying his bills.
He certainly isn't famous for paying his bills, but he is very famous for, if he doesn't get his way, to saying, "I'll see you in court." So, one obviously follows on from the other. And this is one, I think, of just many cases involving Trump that are ongoing at the moment. I mean, he likes to use this sort of thing to keep his name in the public eye. But I do get the feeling that, that there is a slight movement, I think, away of moderate people away from the Republicans and Trump. Although, he keeps rubbishing the reputation of anyone who is likely to stand against him. So, yes, it's watch the space in terms of all the legal cases and suits going on against Trump, but actually getting any money out of him, I mean, we still don't know what his true wealth is, and you always get the impression with Trump that he's got an army of accountants just moving money around to keep things afloat and to avoid paying any taxes or, as you say, Andrew, any legal bills.
Thanks, Maureen. We'll come back to Scotland now, because the Scottish Government's Resilience Committee, SCORE, has met again to discuss the impact of winter on the NHS and social care, and it was chaired by our First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. The First Minister heard updates on rates of respiratory illness, levels of hospital capacity, and actions to alleviate delayed discharge. This includes a nationwide reassessment of hospital patients who are clinically safe to be discharged, so they can be moved home or to a more homely setting as soon as possible. The meeting was attended by the Deputy First Minister, the Health Secretary, and other Cabinet Ministers, along with the Chief Medical Officer and senior representatives from NHS boards, COSLA, Integrated Joint Boards, and the Scottish Ambulance Service. The First Minister said, "There is no doubt we are still seeing very acute demands across most of the health and social care system. The measures discussed at SCORE today are all helping to address these issues, but we remain indebted to the incredible efforts of staff right across the health and social care system for their commitment and hard work during this extremely challenging winter." So, Maureen, as I said, I listed there the attendees at the meeting: the Deputy FM, the Health Secretary, other Cabinet Ministers, Chief Medical Officer, and representatives from NHS boards, COSLA, Integrated Joint Boards, and the Ambulance Service. And I was interested in that, in particular, seeing COSLA and the Integrated Joint Boards, which folks don't know, they're the local authority health and social care boards, and also, of course, key NHS service providers. And I wondered, is this meeting today another example of the very different way in which Holyrood has been operating when compared to the way in which Westminster has been operating, insofar as the First Minister has brought everybody, all the stakeholders together, and sat down and is working with them in order to seek a resolution and to do the best that is possible, rather than accusing them through the pages of the press of pursuing strikes and not caring for patients.
Absolutely, and we saw that during COVID as well, where Boris Johnson took, I think, five or six meetings of their equivalent before he actually turned up to any of them to see the seriousness of the situation. Whereas our First Minister wants to be and is on top of everything, and it is often in these meetings a case of bashing heads together, metaphorically, if you like, and actually getting ahead and doing things that we know work. I mean, one of the things, and I think I might have mentioned this before, about Scotland is that it is, as one senior civil servant said at a meeting I was at once, at a conference of businessmen actually, that Scotland is a manageable unit, that you can learn very quickly of what's working in one health board area, in this case, compared to other areas, and hopefully implement it in that area if it's suitable. So where we have great people working in the NHS and trying everything to help manage the situation and alleviate the situation, we are able to learn where things work well and perhaps get it implemented in other areas quickly. So that's what's good about Scotland in this case. But I noticed that thankfully the cases of flu seem to be on the decrease, which gives a little more breathing space. And I think there's much more use of discharge lounges in our hospitals. But still, there is a huge lack of people, and it's mainly down to lack of staff, not just in the hospitals, but in the social care setting, in our care homes, and our care workers who go and visit and give assistance to people in their own homes. Because in the end of the day, we know that people thrive much better if they're in their own setting. And it's just lack of staff. And again, the word Brexit comes to my mind, and it should come to others. That's not a solution, I know that. But, we simply haven't got the people to train up to do that. And because the wages are so poor and you can earn more with less responsibility in our supermarkets, how is this ever going to be sorted if the UK government aren't going to loosen the purse strings on this? And it is, to my mind, a way of trying to destroy the health service and make it more attractive for privatisation in there and hand it over to their pals. It's really, again, another of me saying, please, can we have this general election as soon as possible?
Understandably, Maureen, thank you. There is one little aspect in terms of the NHS in Scotland where there is recruitment taking place, and we'll look at that briefly just now, because NHS 111 service users who have been experiencing longer waiting times than usual because of the scale of the winter demand. However, NHS 24 is now reporting that the overwhelming majority of callers are being dealt with through their initial contact without the need to be being placed into any queues to receive a call back from clinicians. And last week, the Scottish Government announced that NHS 24 will recruit an additional 200 new staff by the end of next month. The service had already brought 40 whole-time equivalent call operators, call handlers, and clinical supervisors on board in the run-up to Christmas. Following a visit to meet the new cohort of recruits for NHS 24 in Glasgow, the Health Secretary Hamza Yousaf said, "I'm pleased to have been invited along today to meet the new cohort of recruits for NHS 24. These new staff will provide a valuable contribution to the service, which has faced an extremely busy festive period. The pressures of COVID-19, flu and strep A have all contributed to heightened demand on NHS 24 services, both via 111 and through NHS Inform." Now, Maureen, last week Hamza Yousaf also opened a new NHS 24 call centre in Dundee, a little bit closer to you. So how do you think that with the increasing use of NHS 24, how do you think that folks using the NHS, and perhaps maybe older folks in particular, are getting used to the way in which the NHS now engages, in particular using NHS 24? I mean, I know that my mum hates automated call handling call centres, but I've found NHS 24 to be very, very quick, very good and very responsive. And before anybody says anything, I know that anecdotes are not the same as hard data, but in terms of people's experiences, that's what I'm interested in. So do you think, how are you hearing anything from former constituents or from folks that you're talking to about their experience using NHS 24?
I haven't, to be honest, although as Minister for Public Health, I have visited, and Minister for Mental Health, I have visited NHS 24 call centres. And there is one in Aberdeen, actually, too, has been one for quite a while. So they are across the country, and they do excellent work. And, you know, it may take a while, or it has been taking too long to get calls answered, but I would encourage people to stick with that, because it's certainly going to be shorter wait than pitching up at A&E. And the staff are very well trained, and they know when something is of an urgent nature and needs to have an ambulance called, or people have to get to A&E or to a hospital or to minor injuries. And it's another way of making sure that people go to the correct place to get the correct treatment for their illness or injury, and that only the very urgent accident or emergency cases end up at the door of A&E. So I'm glad that Hamza Yousaf has taken on more people in the call centres to help alleviate some of the pressures further down the line. And I think everybody should have that little card in their kitchen on the notice board about the best place to go for your particular ailment that you're suffering, because we know that our pharmacies have been given much more training in what to do in terms of minor ailments. Our pharmacists are well trained, and to make sure that people go to the dentist if it's a dental problem, the opticians if it's an eye problem, and that they go to the correct place to relieve the pressure on A&E. So yes, this is to be welcomed.
Thanks, Maureen. Now, our next item is that an urgent review of the environmental impacts and management of single-use vapes has been commissioned. The review, which comes in response to emerging concerns around the negative consequences of these disposable devices, will inform potential policy responses, which might include a ban. The disposable smoking devices have been linked to issues including litter, plastic waste, and fire risk. Zero Waste Scotland will lead on the review, which will also consider international experience and action, including any key developments in the EU. The Circular Economy Minister, Lorna Slater, said, "Not only are single-use vapes bad for public health, they are also bad for the environment. From litter on our streets to the risk of fires in waste facilities, there are issues which need to be addressed urgently. We will consider the evidence and expert advice and come forward with policy options which could include a potential ban on single-use vapes. In the meantime, we would urge everyone who uses these products to make sure they are disposed of properly." So, Maureen, to come back to a story that we were talking about earlier on this evening, if the law in Scotland was changed as a result of this review and perhaps single-use vapes were banned, do you think Alistair Jack might use a Section 35 order to prevent that new Scottish law too, now that he seems to have got a taste for wielding such unbelievable power? Or beyond that, do you think Michael Gove might try to beat him to it and use the Internal Markets Act to prevent the Scottish Government from banning single-use vapes?
Well, we certainly have been to the forefront in terms of making sure that we don't use single-use plastic straws anymore, or cotton plastic cotton buds and things like that, which have made a great difference. And in terms of the single-use vapes, well, it depends how much attention the UK government still pays to the tobacco lobby, because it is the tobacco companies which in the main supply these vapes, and clearly they haven't had the memo about making sure that they don't contribute to the damaging our environment. I mean, I haven't seen the figures, but when we had the smoking ban, which I was Minister of Public Health at the time, and our determination to make smoking almost non-existent by some date in the 2030s, I think. And pre-COVID, we were making great strides on this, to be honest. And yet we see, I think, our younger people taking up vaping more than we had expected. So there clearly needs to be more education about this among our youngsters. And it's just such a pity that such good work has been done in this area, and yet it seems the tobacco lobby still use their influence in their advertising to prevent us making our population healthier.
Absolutely, Maureen. We will have to wait and see if Westminster attempts to flex its muscles one more time in respect of this possible legislation. But we've got one more item this evening, because Stuart MacDonald's private member's bill on neonatal leave and pay has passed its third reading. The SNP MP's private member's bill on neonatal leave and pay had its third reading in the House of Commons today. The Neonatal Care Leave and Pay Bill provides additional leave and pay to parents of premature and sick babies, in addition to maternity and paternity leave and pay. The bill has received a wide range of support from numerous organisations, including Bliss, The Smallest Things, Pregnant Then Screwed, and Working Families, all of whom have campaigned tirelessly on the issue and have been instrumental in bringing the bill to this stage. The third reading was the final hurdle before the bill goes to the House of Lords for scrutiny there. So, Maureen, looking at this, firstly, well done to Stuart MacDonald for piloting this private member's bill through to this stage, and the very best of luck for him in securing its safe passage through the House of Lords and onto royal assent. But looking at the broader point here, and again looking at the politics of it, does the apparent progress and success of this private member's bill, does it indicate that there is in fact a point in Scottish MPs sitting in Westminster if, for example, they can pilot this sort of very progressive legislation through as a private member's bill to everybody's benefit.
Yes. And it, a private member's bill is the kind of luck of the draw. It literally is, whether your name gets called out further up the list and your chosen subject for a bill has any prospect of getting passed. And clearly, Stuart MacDonald hopefully is on to a winner on this one. And it is something that most young families will surely welcome. And I was thinking while you were talking there, I hope to goodness that it's not something that will fall foul of the UK government's desire to get rid of any rights, workers' rights, that have come from Europe and that they're hoping now to get rid of. So I really hope that the Lords don't try and neuter this bill in any way, but it takes a lot of work to get a private member's bill through the Westminster Parliament. So it's really, well done, Stuart MacDonald, on this.
Thanks, Maureen. Absolutely, all credit to Stuart and the charities and the other organisations and his staff for getting this far with this bill. But I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station and to make new programmes. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 per month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have set ourselves a target of raising £30,000 to enable us to employ more staff to make more programmes. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you'd like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot and on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. If you're watching us when you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Click on the wee bell. Now, we will be back on Sunday at noon with the next edition of the Full Scottish, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching this evening, and of course, I'd like to say a very special thanks to our very special guest, Maureen Watt. Thanks, Maureen.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us this evening on Broadcasting Scotland. Today seems to be a day in history for folks who pay attention to things to do with the crown. On this day in 1356, Edward Balliol, the son of John Balliol, the Tomb Tabard, relinquished his claim to the Scottish crown. He relinquished it to King Edward III of England in exchange for an English pension, of course. And in 1936, King George V died. He was succeeded by King Edward VIII, who abdicated 325 days later in order to marry Mrs. Simpson. I'm away to live in a nice house in the Bois de Boulogne in Paris. I hope that you have a very peaceful weekend. Bye-bye.